My superpower is engineering. I've been a roboticist almost all my life now. I think engineering is just as creative as the arts. Engineers, we solve problems. It impacts the world. It makes a difference. Without IEEE, I don't think I would have the network that I have. Anyone can get involved with IEEE USA at any time. There's an immense amount of value for anyone at any career stage.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to today's IEEE USA Livestream webinar, Organizational Fit and Retention, How to Get the Right People and Get Them to Stay. I'm your host, Jonathan Cho. IEEE USA's goal is to create programming that is valuable, relevant, and of interest to you. We'll be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event and would love your feedback. We value your opinions and would appreciate it if you could take a few minutes and share your thoughts. Our presenter for today is Dr. Tim Carey. Tim is a partner with Cal Talent Solutions LLC, where he develops assessment instruments and delivers consulting services to clients globally, and has delivered talent development services to thousands of high-level executives across dozens of organizations. I'll let him talk more about that. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about organizational fit and retaining people. We're going to talk about how to get the right people and also encourage them to stay. I, first of all, want to talk about the agenda, a few quick introductions, then we'll talk about trends in the workplace. We'll talk about values, both what they are and how we measure them. And then we'll talk about organizational fit, both what is it and why should you care. And then we'll also add a few case studies, and then we're also going to talk about group results for those of you who completed the CBI. Hopefully many of you received the email, and we do have a small sample, but an interesting one. Okay, throughout this program, we will be allowing questions. I'll probably take the questions at the end. We will definitely have time then to do that. So contribute your questions in the chat and we will go from there. So, quick introduction. As Jonathan mentioned, I'm a founding member of Cal and a partner. My background is industrial organizational psychology, which for those of you who don't know, which I would imagine is many since we are not good at marketing in this field, that is the application of psychological principles to the workplace. We do assessment, training, development of employees, as well as selection and at times recruitment. My background also includes about 20 years experience based out of Hong Kong, across APAC, Europe, Middle East, and Asia, and North America. A lot of assessment, a lot of training, and significant development of multinational executives and managers. A lot of these are companies that you would recognize. I won't go into too many of those, but I can definitely talk more about that. As well, I taught this subject at the Chinese University of Hong Kong for about 15 years and counting. My focus is on graduates and undergraduates and industrial organizational psychology in particular. So Cal Talent is really all things leadership development. We go from assessment for selection to every aspect of development that you can imagine, including training, coaching, all kinds of other development activities. We are psychologists, some are academics, some are applied psychologists like myself, and we are working to develop many multinationals in terms of executives and managers. Okay, so I want to talk first about workplace trends because this has major implications for what we're going to talk about today. When we think of today's work world, we can say it's a VUCA world, and I would imagine many of you have heard that term now. In fact, you're probably sick of the term, but actually this is relevant for what we're going to discuss. So the world is volatile. We now have a war in Europe that no one expected. We have an epidemic that we're just coming out of, and apparently that's just one of many that could hit us, according to the virologists. We also have things like climate change. We have advances in tech, which I'm sure many of you have contributed to. Thanks for that. And we also have unrivaled complexity. Someone from the 1950s would not recognize today's organizations. They are matrixed, they are global, and they are incredibly complex. So the person from the 1950s IBM probably would have difficulty navigating any of today's global organizations. In addition to that, we have increasing regulations. We also have cultural norms that are changing. The new generation seems to have different values from the older generations and is expressing that in both the jobs they take and the amount of time they spend in those jobs, which is often less than we managers would prefer. So it's a volatile world, it's a VUCA world. But the other backdrop to this is that in the US, the work environment has changed. Even as late as 1979, the US was a heavily manufacturing-based economy. Today, we're service-based. About 90% of what we produce is services. Now, that impacts us because we can't hire the same people we used to hire. When you think about manufacturing, many of the people you were going to hire were on the line. You could walk by them, observe them, and correct things right away if they were doing something that was different or incorrect. I remember this, having worked in a factory during my youth. We had a roving supervisor who came and talked to us very, very quickly if something went wrong. Now, when you think about a service economy, we are talking about call centers that are in different countries with people taking 100 calls a day. We're talking about salespeople who are traveling all over the country, possibly the world. And we're talking about people who are much more autonomous and much more in charge of how they interact with other coworkers and customers on a daily basis. We can't supervise them the way we could. It is not a command and control model anymore. So what this means is that we need to think about who to hire and how we hire them. Okay, so Cal's come up with the idea that there is a big three of talent. When we talk about the big three, the first thing that you look for in talent is skills and abilities. I mean, if you're hiring a CFO and that person has no skills and no ability in finance, in financial procedures and processes, you're not going to hire them. That's a basic. They have to have the skills and ability. But today, they also have to have sustainability. They have to be able to weather the storms of the VUCA world and the new economy. We also talked, though, about drive. And this is something that hasn't gained as much attention as it probably should, but is proving to be very important for organizations. When we talk about drive, we're talking about both motivation and values. And motivation typically comes from values. So at the core of this is values. And this is something that we need to hire for more often. So what are values? Values are essentially the principles that inform your decision making. When you're not sure, you come into a situation that's new or different to you, you don't know what to do because you haven't done it 100 times, you fall back on your values. And this is not an explicit process. This is not something you say, okay, I've never been in this situation before, so what should I do? Oh, I know. What are my values? That's not how it works. These are things you typically don't think about, but still rely on. Now, as we prioritize our values, we determine who we are. We essentially tell the world who we are and what we stand for. Okay. So when we talk about how to understand values, we have to look at the iceberg model. And this is a very psychological approach to hiring and to considering talent. But think about when you think about an iceberg, there's a little bit above the water and there's a lot below the water or the water line. So when we talk about what's above the water, that's what's obvious, what we can see. And with talent, that is essentially behaviors, performance. You know, we can watch someone behave and perform. Again, it's not as easy as it used to be because those people are not sitting right next to you in the office all the time, especially now that they're probably sitting at home. But we do have access to some behavior. For example, watching people send emails, maybe listening in on calls with customers. So there are ways you can get a chance to observe behavior. What you can't observe is beliefs, is expectations, is how people talk to themselves, what people need, etc. So to gain an understanding of that, we have to go far beyond just observing talent. So how do we do that? Well, we have certain methods that we can use to assess values. And the three that we typically use are, again, watching behaviors. So I would always tell students who are wondering about how to understand themselves, observe yourself. Watch yourself in different situations. You know, if given a chance to cheat on a test, are you going to do that? Okay, and what does that say about your values? You value your results more than the process. So we definitely need to observe behaviors. But we can also interview people. And when we talk about interviewing, we talk about a very specific type of interviewing. This is a values interview. You ask people about different situations and talk them through how they would approach those situations. Now, this is not a perfect process. When you're interviewing someone, especially about values, there are what we call social desirability cues. People want to look good in front of other people. So if you're interviewing someone about values, I would say hire a psychologist. I mean, I'm a little biased on this, and other people can certainly do a values interview effectively as well. But this requires a lot of digging and a lot of probing. So we need to be sure that people fully understand what their values are by taking them through these situations. So an interview is a good tool. You want to be sure that you use it effectively. And then finally, we have psychometric tests. And a good psychometric test will uncover values without the person even realizing that they're answering questions about values. With the CBI, we went through many iterations of questions. You know, does this question work? Are there any other ways this could be interpreted? Is it a global perspective? Would someone from any other culture answer this the same way? So a psychometric test is important and useful, but at the same time, it's not a perfect solution to determining values. The best way, in fact, would just be to use all of these methods. So watch someone on the job, see how they behave, see how they interact, interview them with a values-based interview, and then do a psychometric test. Okay. So when we talk about values, you're probably thinking, well, what does that even look like? Like, what is a value from the Cal perspective or from the psychological perspective? This is a subset of the values that we use. As you know, probably there are a huge number of values that people might have. what we did is select the values that would be most applicable to work based on our research. And the research is based on 100 years worth of theories and also a very intense process of determining what goes where after gathering a lot of data. So, you know, sometimes we had trouble defining what the actual value was. So you might look at some of these and say, oh, is that really hedonism, or is that honor? But let me talk you through very quickly just one of these. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I will answer questions if you do have further questions on these. So achievement, the first value or the first factor, and we gather the values into factors. Achievement is really about how you define success in your life. And if you look around you, people define success in different ways. Some say, you know, if I have a big car, the newest car, the biggest house, that's achievement for me. In essence, sorry, it's money. Okay. Some say, I want to be respected by my peers. It's really about honor. Okay. I may not have a lot of money, but I do have the respect of my peers. And then some say it's really about making a difference. Like having, you know, 100 years after I'm in the job, people will still look back and say, wow, that was a great achievement and that moved the field forward. Okay, so when we talk about success, we talk about three different dimensions: honor, money, and results. Okay, and that's kind of how this is designed. So now I want to talk about organizational fit. And you're probably wondering how values have any relation to organizational fit, but we will cover that as well. So first of all, what is it? Well, if you've been hanging around in industrial organizational psychology for any time at all, you've probably heard P-org fit, or person organization fit. And that can take a number of forms, but basically it's the compatibility between individuals and organizations. It's how people and organizations fit together. Now, that, first of all, from the organization's perspective, that is, does it satisfy an individual's needs or preferences? Okay, so what the organization's offering, does that satisfy what the individual needs? On the individual side, does the individual have the abilities that the organization needs? So when the organization looks at the individuals, do they have the abilities? And remember, this goes back to the big three that we talked about: skills and abilities. Without the skills and abilities, that person is not of much use to an organization for that position. But we also talk about fit around values, and this is really what I want to focus on. The work-related and work style values have to sync with or fit the organization's culture and values and norms. Essentially, what we're looking for is people who want the same things that an organization is going to give, not only needs and preferences, but abilities and straight up values. You know, does the organization value the same thing that I value? Now, you're probably wondering, well, vague, what does that even mean? How can we even define what an organization's values are, even if we have the individual's values? Well, actually, organizations do this all the time. When you look at an organization, they always have a vision, mission, and values statement. Almost always. I would say probably 98% of organizations have this. And they're not hard to find. If you go on a website, on their website, you can very quickly discover what the needs, what the mission, vision, and values are. So we look at that. Now, not every organization lives up to their mission, vision, values, but we want an organization, as someone coming into the organization, we want to make sure that that does at least fit with our values And then we start looking at, well, do they live by those values? Now, to make this a bit more concrete, let me talk about a couple of organizations. Now, I can't give you the names just out of fairness. This is relatively anecdotal. This is based on my own experience in working with one of the organizations. But let me talk about how this works so you can understand how the values, the person-organization fit works, especially around values. Company A, I did a lot of work in the 2000s up to about 2010 with Company A. They were a giant multinational. They were not based in the US. Their values, as per their website, which I just found about a week ago, were around honesty, integrity, and respect for people. Okay, and I saw that. This was an organization that really did care about their people. They spent a lot of time developing their people. And when they were talking about moves, which happened a lot in this organization, especially for some of the senior execs, they considered the family, how the move would affect the family, and how that person would survive and thrive in the new role, usually in a different country and culture. Now, contrast that to Company B, whose stated values are committed to being the world's premier blank company, premier company in the industry, and continuously achieve superior financial and operating results and adhere to high ethical standards. Now, notice the difference between these two value statements. Company B is all about being the best. They don't say anything about respect for people, caring for people, taking care of their people. And what I saw was that was exactly played out as you would expect. So what we had was Company A caring about their people, taking the people into account when making decisions. Company B was what I would describe as harsh and very cut and dried in terms of being a meritocracy. Basically, it was at least produce or you're out. But if you don't produce significantly above what we expect, then you don't get a promotion either. And there was no sentimentality about letting people go. It was basically, here's your papers, go. You didn't make it. Okay, so if you imagine looking at one of those companies from the perspective of an employee, you probably think, who would want to work for Company B? Well, let me tell you, there are people, and we're going to talk about one in a minute. But interestingly, when I was working with executives from Company A, they were talking about Company B, and they told me this. This is exactly what they told me. And since then, I've done some research on that company, never having worked for them, possibly because they don't develop their people as well. But it seems to me that they live by those values, that they are trying to be the best in the industry and that they don't care as much about people. Okay, so again, who's going to work for Company B? Well, let me tell you. From the person perspective, these are two real cases of people I've known for a while. Person A was working in a different industry from Company A and B, but she said, what I love about this industry is that we push people hard to get results, and we don't have to have empathy in this industry. You produce or you get out, okay? And as a psychologist, that's not a situation I'd want to work in, because she was very tough with people. I remember her telling me some of the feedback she gave to people, and it was basically, how could you hand in this garbage? I don't think this is the right place for you. You just need to find another company and probably another industry. Okay, that was the feedback. Now, she's thriving there in that industry because one of her values is results, and that's one of her main values. Contrast her to person B, who said, I want to work in an organization that treats me like a family. I want to be respected. I want people to take time and work with me and develop me and respect me and treat me like a member of their family. Not a dysfunctional family, an actual functioning family. This person ended up in an NGO or a charity. Charities' values, as you might expect, to very much generalize, are to help people. And that's really what she was about. But not only helping people, also respecting people within the workplace and treating them nicely, what we would call nicely. Okay, so this is person organizational fit around values, specifically values. Okay, so you might say, we've got this, we have good values fit, so what? Who cares? Well, this is something that you as a manager and the organization should care about, because the research has shown that when we're selecting talent for values, those who fit better around their values have a better organizational commitment. They are more committed to the organization. Okay, that means they'll likely stay longer, etc. Which is the next finding. You will retain people more effectively if their values fit with the organizational values. Okay, someone for working for company B, the absolute meritocracy, harsh, what some would consider a harsh environment, person A would love that. She would thrive in that scenario. And she would not thrive in a charity because she would be too impatient to get results. Okay, she would upset everyone. The company would not be a good fit, so she would leave. And that's what's been found. People stay longer when their values fit those of the organization. Now, you also see more helping behavior, which means better psychological well-being in these organizations. You find more job satisfaction, more perceived fairness, and more trust in managers within the organization. Now, when we're talking about talent development, and this is a little bit indirect, but when you have a good fit in terms of values, it enhances the effect of training and development. Training and development works, that's been demonstrated numerous times, but it's actually enhanced if there is good fit in terms of values. Now that enhancement will also affect job satisfaction and performance. So people will perform even better than they would have if there was bad fit with talent development initiatives. So having good fit is important. Now the other thing is, and this is stepping back from values and just getting into general person organization fit. The better the fit you have, partly as a result of values, I might add, is that you get higher salaries, higher job levels attained, and the number of promotions. So when looking at person organizational fit in general, including values, but not exclusively values, you get these good outcomes. So I hope you can see that it's worthwhile and useful and actually important to look at values fit with an organization. Okay, so let's talk about a few case studies. Cal is based in Hong Kong, although we have a global reach. And one of the initial studies we did was on a Taoist academy in China. And what we did was we looked at the values of the teachers and the graduates. And what we found was very interesting. First of all, I want to point out that our N, our sample size, was very small. Teachers, we only had 5. Graduates, we had 22. But what we did find was significance. Okay, so significant results were found, especially for compliance. In fact, this was rated in the top 2 values of both the graduates and the teachers. Now, when you think of monks of any faith, compliance is probably an important thing. But interestingly, you'll notice that autonomy for the teachers and less so for the graduates was also very important. And you might think, how do you get compliance and autonomy in the same group that has huge values? Well, when we think of autonomy, it's really about being able to make your own choices in life. And in societies or cultures where choices are fairly constrained, autonomy might be deciding that you're going to seek different things from to determine success in your life. Okay, so this is when you're a Taoist teacher or monk, that's not something I would say, and I was going to say Chinese, but I would say any culture would probably encourage their children to do. If you know, Johnny or Susie in the US comes up and says to their parents, I'm going to be a monk or a nun. Some parents would encourage it, but I would say the majority would say, tough life. I don't know if you really want that. So having the autonomy to decide to do that is something that was important to the teachers, but also to the graduates of this academy. I'm going to leave the last two. I mean, meaning is an obvious one. And that was important to both graduates and teachers. Hedonism, I can talk about a little bit later. That was kind of an interesting finding in itself, but I'll talk about what that means a bit later if someone has questions. I don't want to spend too much time on this. But notice that material outcomes or material possessions were very low in terms of the values for these monks. Exactly what you would expect. Okay, we don't expect monks to, you know, want to be driving a Rolls Royce, and that's what we found. Okay, values matter. If you had a monk who valued a Rolls Royce and was in this Taoist academy in China, it would be a bad fit, to put it mildly. Okay, so let's now talk about another case study, which is some of you, if those who filled out the values inventory are indeed on the call. We had 22 people as of a few days ago fill out this inventory. Let's talk a bit about the demographics. First of all, pretty senior group. 10 had done more than 21 years of experience. Mostly male, probably not surprising to many of you. And then pretty senior in terms of age. Almost half were, in fact, much more than half were born before 1979. Okay, so, you know, before I was saying that there are cultural differences in values, that there are cultural differences in the workforce. Well, one of the cultural differences is values. Okay, so this is a picture of a fairly senior group that we have come up with. So I want to cover this a bit in terms of what we found, and then we can discuss it. You can ask questions if you want, but I think it's a very interesting case study. Okay, when we look at the findings, if you look at the bottom of this, to help you read it, we have low, moderately high, and high. So moderately high is between 50 and 75, according to the numbers at the bottom. And high would be above 75. So notice that there was no value was particularly high as we defined it, but there were some that were trending higher than others. And when we talk about values, it's really not about who scores very high, but it's about the relationship of the values to each other, how we prioritize our values. So the other thing you need to know is that the lines from green to yellow are about standard deviations. So basically, the longer the line, the more variance or the more different responses we got, high to low. So I want to I'm not going to cover all of these. Clearly, it'd take us probably an hour, but I want to cover a few of them. Let's talk about results first. This had the lowest standard deviation and still a moderately high result. People in this group value results, and that's probably something that we would expect, because as an engineer, it's most likely, if you're frontline, very clear whether you're getting results or not. Does the plane fly? Does the dam hold the water? So results are important to everyone, and they're a pretty significant importance. Now, interestingly, enjoyment also came up as moderately high. So that's the sixth one from the top under hedonism. Enjoyment is really about looking at life as something to be enjoyed, to take part in, and to have a good time with. And in this case, we're talking about specifically work. So this group values enjoyment at work. Now, when we talk about a fairly senior group, these are people who probably are later in their careers and think, you know what, I may have 10, 15 years left. I'm going to have a good time at this job. And you know what? Also, I don't have to do some of the dirty work that I did before. Now I can do some of the stuff that I really enjoy. So that's important to me. Otherwise, I'd quit because, I don't need to work as much anymore. Okay. Leading also came up as high, third from the bottom, but there was a big standard deviation there. This group, again, is senior and probably values leading. So they're almost selected to be leaders because they're a more senior group. Now, interestingly, three things came out fairly low. Compliance, okay? These people are not as interested in complying with the dictates of very senior management, although there is definitely some variation there from very low compliance to almost moderate compliance. But there's also high risk avoidance. Actually, they're high on risk avoidance, which means sorry, let me revise that. They're low on risk avoidance, which means they don't value avoiding risk. Now, this was interesting also, but my interpretation is that at this point in their career, they don't have to worry about risk. They're probably not going to be fired if they make a couple of mistakes, and they're depended on to move the company forward. So some risk taking is going to be necessary. And by the way, you probably have to take some risks to get to a senior level in an organization. And then finally, well-being was not as valued as some of the other values. It wasn't as high a priority. Although again, there's significant variation there from absolutely no, very low focus on well-being or value of well-being to about moderate worry or consideration of well-being. And this is about taking care of yourself, ensuring that you're psychologically and physically healthy on the job. And you may think, that's an obvious one, but actually, if you have an emergency and you have to work all night, that's not good for your well-being, psychologically, emotionally, or physically. Okay, and if you're more senior, then it's likely that you don't have to focus on well-being as much because you already have it. But it's interesting that's not a value, because you would think as you get more senior, I know as I get older, I have to focus more on my health to ensure that I keep it for the next 30 years at least. Okay, so interesting findings. All in all, probably not what you would expect from a stereotype or from the stereotype of engineers. Okay, so this is why you need to go beyond stereotypes and really try to understand people and what they value, and ensure that those values are also reflected in the organization. Okay. So let me just summarize then. We talked about the fact that we're living in a VUCA world, that things are changing all around us, that we have to adapt very quickly to everything around us. We talked about the fact that the economy is changing in the US and that we don't have the IBM of the 1950s where we have just command and control and it's very simple to work with people and to manage people. We talked about the definition of values and how we measure those values. Remember, we can observe behaviors, interview, or use a test, and how the fact that really it's best to do all three. We talked about what organizational fit is. And again, it can cover a number of things. Do they have the ability? Does the organization fit the needs of the person? And is there complementarity between the two in terms of values? And then we talked about the monks, the interesting findings, mostly expected, some unexpected. And then we talked about you all, the 22 of you who turned in the test by the deadline to do the analysis, and talked about why we might see what we do see or don't see. Finally, we talked about the importance of values in organizations, how these, if there is a good fit between the organization and the person in terms of values, we see a number of good outcomes, including, as was alluded to in the title, retention, that people will be retained for much longer than if there is not a values fit. Okay, so that is the presentation. I just want to mention a couple other things. First of all, if you haven't completed the CVI and now are interested, we welcome you to complete that. You will get 2 emails. One is a very basic report, and that will be followed with another email about a more extensive report. The other report takes a bit more time to put together. So if you've only received 1 email so far, you will be getting another one. Again, this is free. This is something that we hope will help you. And again, the information will be kept anonymous. It will be confidential, although we will share results as we just did, where none of you will be identified. And in fact, we will destroy your reports once once you have those. We are much more interested in the normative data in developing norms for different groups than we are in individuals. Although part of what we offer at Cal is feedback on the reports, and we'd be happy to give you more feedback if you were to give us a call or actually to give us an email, because we'll give you our email address. Okay, and then one more piece before we go to questions. Sorry, actually it's not showing up, but we also have developed a resilience test, and as we talked about in the VUCA world, resilience is critical. So I would be happy to come back and talk about resilience if that's an interest or a need or a value for any of you. All right, thanks very much, and I'm ready for questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Tim. So folks, as Tim mentioned, we are at the Q&A segment of the webinar. Please post your questions in the comment section and we'll load them onto the stream for Tim to answer. We've also added the link to the CVI assessment in the comments/live chat tab, so you should be able to access that whenever you need to. So Tim, before we get to our audience questions, I do have a question of my own. So you've gone a lot. You've delved really heavily into the importance of person organizational fit. Um, so I do have a question about people. Say, for an example, a company hiring an entry level position. Do you have any thoughts on the importance of culture fit versus technical experience for that kind of position? I know it takes like
Yep.
a good balance, but typically for those kinds of positions, what do you think employers should consider more?
Yeah, that's a great question. Interestingly, and this just happened about 6 months ago, I saw a study that said um, experience counts for about 6% of the variance of success on the job. In other words, 94% of what makes someone successful has nothing to do with experience. Now, a lot of that is going to be willingness to learn, a value for learning. If you bring someone on, they have no experience and no interest in learning, that's not going to work because you're going to have to teach them a lot. Um, but I would say that at least bring on people with the attitude and the interest in learning, and then ensure that they fit. And I'll give you an example of that. I had a friend who graduated from a Ivy League program with an MBA and was recruited by Google and eventually joined. He said that they had 25. First of all, they had 25 interviews, which is a lot, and probably not how I would do selection. But in this case, what Google was looking for was cultural fit. Was he googly enough to be a Google employee? What they didn't have was a position. So they actually hired him for a position that they created. And that was a classic example of organizational fit. He fit the organization so well that they wanted him, but they didn't have a position. So, did he have the technical experience? Definitely not. So they hired a position, they created a position for him, hired him, and he's still there, a decade or so later. So it's, I would say, culture fit is much more important than technical experience, as long as, along with the cultural fit, you have someone who's willing to learn.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Thanks for the insight. It's really interesting that they were willing to create a position specifically for him. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, no, definitely great. So this question from our audience member. Um, well, actually, not so much a question, but some feedback. Eva says this seems contradictory in some aspects to what I'm hearing during interviews. And followed by that, actually, we had another audience member who asks as a follow up: do you think these results from probably senior members who are representative of who's being sought slash hired these days?
Hmm. Um, yeah, that's a good question. I'm actually not sure. I mean, I think different groups have different values, and certainly the younger generation seems to be much more YOLO. You only live once, so they're less willing to put up with you know days and nights of hardcore grind. Um, but I also think that at the entry level, um, I've thought about this a lot since my wife currently is in an entry level position as she looks for a more senior role. And it's very interesting to listen to the values of the people who come in at entry level. Now, I'll differentiate the entry level between university graduates and non-graduates. So I'm talking about non-graduates. If we're talking about entry-level non-graduates, these are fairly routine, mundane, almost manufacturing type jobs where there's not much variance day to day. And these people turn over for 40 cents an hour, and you can't blame them. I mean, working at Taco Bell versus in a store, it's not much different in terms of the job. Many of those roles don't take much time to learn, and there's very little cost to moving from organization to organization. Now, when we talk about graduates, especially what we used to call fresh graduates in Asia, my experience in talking to about 1,000 of them about their careers was, I will take any job that you give me, as long as you're not, and I have to be careful of this because there are a lot of there's controversy over this, but as long as your product doesn't kill people, or you don't force me to do things that are unethical, I'll take the job. And really, if your products kill people, I had students who would take the job anyway because it was a job. And mom and dad were saying, get a job quickly. So I do think that there are differences in different groups in terms of values. And I do think that the organizations need to consider those. I hope that answers your question. It was a bit roundabout of an
Yeah, no,
answer.
definitely. I think the insight definitely helps. Eva, hope that answered your question. Actually, we do have another question from Eva. Seems like the thinking behind this requires an empathetic mindset, but how do you navigate that with senior leadership that may not be able to think that way?
That's a great question, also. Yeah, and that's a problem. And this is around cultural values within the organization. Ideally, the senior management will live the values, whether it's company A with the empathy and the respect for people, or company B, which is all about results. Um, if they're not living the values, so for example, you have an empathetic or empathic senior leader in company B that's all about results, then people are going to get confused. Um, but ideally, you would need to be able to identify the values. So if I'm hiring for company B, the tough, disciplined, results focused company, I'm going to look for a certain kind of person. And I would say I don't have to be as empathic, but I do have to understand a person's values. I need to know whether that person's going to last in this organization or not. And I guess now that I'm saying that, I see what you're saying also, I think, which is you have to be somewhat empathetic or empathic to understand that, that those are this person's values.
Mhm.
So yes, I guess that's the short answer. You would need to be empathic enough to understand the values of these people, whether you're working for company A or company B.
Great, thank you. And thanks for the question, Eva.
Mhm.
This next question, Carrie asks, on the value chart, there are factors and then sort of subcategories of dimensions. Would most people fall into one dimension per factor?
Hmm, that's interesting. I don't know. That's a good question.
And if
I'm
you'd
gonna
like, we
write
can
it
probably
down.
go back to the chart to take a look at it as well.
Mhm. Okay, let's see. Um, Looking at it, yes, but these are also orthogonal values, meaning that you could be high on a number of them. So you could be high on honor and money, but you're most likely going to prioritize one over the other. Um, yeah, yes. So the short answer is it's an interesting question. We'll take a look at it, but I think you probably would fall out higher on one than another. For example, if you really want to be respected by others, um, you probably won't care as much about money, but you may care about both. You may, and it's entirely possible that you want to be respected and make a lot of money.
Gotcha, thank you.
Mhm.
So this next kind of situation from our audience member, my company says that industry-wide there's a lack of engineers, but are there considerably fewer graduating engineers in recent years? If not, where are they all going? He does add below, for background, his company has had several open positions for quite a while, and many older engineers are retiring at a rapid pace. So
Mhm.
where are the engineers going if there are not fewer graduating?
Well, I hope they're coming to psychology. But that's a good question. I don't know, actually. I remember talking to someone in the around 2007, 2008 in Hong Kong, and he was saying that he was an engineer in Hong Kong, and China was graduating 100,000 engineers a year. So he was getting out of the field. He felt like there was no future. I think that was definitely the wrong move, given what's happened since. But I'm not sure where they're going. Um, I've also read some uh, discussions about how we are treating girls as they get into STEM, and somewhere around seventh or eighth grade, they're kind of turned off of STEM. It may be as late as sophomore year in high school, and people are not really sure why. What messages they're getting, uh, why suddenly they turn away from these from STEM related subjects. So I'm not really sure, but I do think it's going to be a major problem, especially as technology advances. You look at what's going on with Tesla. We need engineers for these for new electric cars. We need engineers for what's becoming a space race. Um, there's going to be a desperate need for engineers in the near future, if not right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. Oh, so he did just also add, I'm a psych grad, but switching to engineering. So great to hear that.
I guess we lost another one, but
Yeah.
actually, we do need probably more engineers and psychologists at this point. So,
Mm.
yeah.
This next question, John asks, how does diversity inclusion play into the organizational fit model of evaluating potential candidates?
Hmm. So, I think this is a value that the company needs to have. And we see this a lot. Companies talk about DEI, but do they really do anything about it? And in defense of companies, they may not know what to do. Would you hire someone who is not as qualified, but who is a part of a minority group? Or would you hire someone who is more qualified and part of the majority group? That's a tough call. I do think, and this is kind of where I come down on the whole DEI perspective. I do think that we need to give minority groups a chance because historically they have not been given a chance. And as a psychologist, that has done real damage to the psyche of a number of minority groups over the centuries that they've been held down. So I think seeing other members of minority groups in very senior positions gives hope to younger members of those minority groups and helps them at least believe that they can do it. And that's a huge step. So, again, organizations need to value DEI and live it. And to live it, they need to learn how to do it. And that's, I think, where we are now. Companies are just learning how to really support DEI candidates.
Absolutely. Thank you. And thanks for the question, John. So we did have one kind of like one statement from Brendan Godfrey, who's actually our current IEEE USA VP of Career and Member Services. One measure of need for engineers is their salaries.
Mm-hmm.
Which, I think it seems pretty valid from what I've seen and heard. And probably the data in our IEEE USA salary survey that engineers that we've gotten from those surveys kind of point towards that direction as well. So thank you for that statement.
Yep.
This next question from Prince. With all the cultural fit checks in interviews, we still find people who scale through but do not stay with the company for long. How do you develop a system that'll encourage employees to develop a value mindset that'll help in retention?
Well, I would say the first thing you need to do is live the values. And that needs to be drilled into all the leaders, all the executives, all the managers that this is now a value and you need to live it. So Jack Welch said, expect what you inspect. You need to inspect values. Are people living the values? I would also say that you definitely need to do exit interviews for people who leave. At the very lowest frontline level, this may not be possible as companies get ghosted all the time from the interview process right on through. They accept a job, they don't show up the first day. They stay 2 days, then they don't show up. So we're also seeing this happen somewhat in fresh graduate jobs. People are starting entry-level jobs as, for example, an engineer, but don't stay. I would really want to know why they're leaving, and I would chase them even if they ghost the company and find out what happened. Why did they go somewhere else? If you do not understand why they are leaving, then it's hard to develop any kind of system to encourage the development of those values. The other thing is that some companies have a very strong culture where others have weaker cultures. When we talk about trying to think, well, I mean, talking to people who have been to working for Google, you look at the Google offices. I mean, that's indicative of a culture. You've got slides, you've got pool tables, sleep pods, bring your dog to work. That's all a very different culture from, the IBM of the 1950s. But you want to make sure that you're giving people what they want. You want to make sure that you're meeting their needs and their preferences. If you can do that, you make the job sort of handcuffing people in a good way. They look around, they say, well, why would I want to go to work for that company? I can't bring my dog to work, So understand what they need and then build the system around that.
Gotcha. Thank you. This next question, Chad asks, can someone score high in all areas? And he does follow up with, are some of these mutually exclusive?
Yeah. They are built to be not mutually exclusive. They're built to be completely independent. So technically, you could be high on, and I'm just trying to think, well, so honor and money, those would seem to be pretty mutually exclusive. Either you want respect from people or you want cash, but typically you wouldn't want both, people would think, but really a lot of people do. I mean, I've known a lot of people who thrive on the respect of others, but you better offer them a good salary or they're not even going to show up. And leave it at that. So yes, they should be. You should be able to theoretically score high on all of these, but not many people do. In fact, I don't think anyone we've ever seen does. And really, even if you score in the high, how do I say it, in the high section of all of these, so say you're above the 75th percentile against the norm group for all of these, we would look at the prioritization. There may be very minute differences between your scores on some of these, but that would be your priority.
Got it. Thank you. And thanks for the question, Chad. Folks, we'll take a few more questions before we close off. This next question, a really great one. Abdullah asks, any advice for new graduates with no experience? How can they sell themselves to get hired?
Yeah, that's a tough question. What I've always encouraged people to do is informational interviewing. And if you want to send me an email, I can send you a booklet that a friend of mine wrote that's the best thing I've ever seen on informational interviewing. It seems to me, and I've, having done a job search recently myself, applying to jobs from LinkedIn seems to be, if I dare say it, a complete waste of time. It still seems to be that it's how well people know you. Have you sat in front of them and talked to them? And have you had a chance to impress them face to face? If you have no experience in addition, one suggestion that was made to me, which I really liked, is go out and get it. I mean, there are plenty of NGOs or charities that are looking for help. So while you're looking for a job, join one of those and do what you want to do in the workplace to get that experience. So even though it isn't maybe official experience that's paid, it still counts. And also, when you think about just judging people's values, if you're donating something to a charity, people will assume that you have integrity and that you care for people and whatever cause they're they're espousing at that charity, and that gets you just a little bit more respect, I think. I'm probably biased though.
No, absolutely. I really like what you mean by, or your point about informational interviews as well. That's definitely a strategy that I've seen a lot in my research as well. Definitely gives people the opportunity to create a relationship with potential employers even before they go through the interview process.
Hmm.
Definitely a lot to be able to learn from that, just those interactions. So thanks for the
Hmm.
question, Abdullah. This last question, Daniel asks, can you? So Prince's questions was about false positives. Can you comment on false negatives? For example, companies assessing a person as not being a good fit when really they are.
Yeah, and I would say that probably happens a significant amount of, number of times out of the total number of times that they are selecting people. Um, what I would suggest is do the full range of assessment techniques. So observe behaviors, do an interview, a values-based interview, and then give them a test. Now, unfortunately, in psychology, it's not a perfect science. We are definitely going to have false negatives. We're going to have people who we say, they wouldn't be a fit, when in fact they are. And some of this may be people who are just not as aware of values and are making judgments on something else. But even if they're making judgments based on values, they may not fully understand the organization's values and how to get the values out of these candidates. So it definitely happens. The more data you can get, the more likely it won't happen. And also the more experienced and understanding the hiring manager is about values, the less likely that you will have a false negative.
Great, thank you so much. So, folks, we are out of time. Tim, I'd like to thank you for giving our audience insight into ensuring how employers can ensure person organization fit and how they can work towards working working towards that as well. And
Mhm.
thank you to our audience for tuning in for your great questions as well. As mentioned in the beginning of the webinar, we will be sending a short survey to all registrants after this event and would love your feedback regarding this webinar. We've also included the link to the free CVI assessment again in the live chat/comment section. So be sure to check that out when you can. Check back daily on our social media for future live stream updates, and we hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.